Today is the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. In this document, Thomas Jefferson famously condemns King George III for transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to America. For 2.5 centuries, these Hessians have been remembered in American pop culture as ruthless guns for hire, or as the punchline to a joke for being drunk on Christmas. But the true story of these auxiliaries is much more complex, fascinating, and deeply woven into the fabric of America. Welcome to Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and as always, I'm joined by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. We're sure that every history podcast is going to have a huge episode for the 4th of July, and there's going to be a lot of great information out there to commemorate the 250th. But for us here at Prime and Load, we wanted to focus on something that we believe we have some expertise in. So today we're going to take a look at those soldiers specifically mentioned in the Declaration. Who are these German soldiers? How is it that they came to fight alongside the British? And what did they think about the New World when they got here? Thank you for joining us for The Misunderstood Enemy, Hessians in North America. And from all of us here at Prime and Load, Happy Independence Day. Today, Alex, we're going to be talking about specifically the Hessians, quotes, Hessian troops that get sent to North America during the British struggle to maintain control of the American colonies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say, you know, for those who are hoping for a little bit of like July 4th in Philadelphia with Thomas Jefferson to celebrate the 250th, the Hessians are right there in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, you know, Jefferson is listing this long train of abuses and usurpations, and if you actually read the whole thing, which I think Americans sometimes don't always do, there are a lot of military causes for the United. Jefferson lists a lot of military causes for the United States to sort of form its own independent nation. But the third from last is. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. So today we're going to be looking at those large armies of cruel, perfidious, barbarous mercenaries.
I'm sure that echoes your opinion.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Yeah, I would have written it the exact same way, for sure. Just me and TJ hanging out. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think one of the first things that comes to mind, and we've touched on this before in other shows, when we talk about Hessians, that is kind of a misnomer, right?
Yeah, like basically everything about these guys is a misnomer, and we'll get into like, you know, were they Hessians, were they mercenaries, and hopefully to everyone's satisfaction. I'm sure there are a lot of folks who are really into the Hessians right now with the 250th anniversary. So hopefully we can do them justice and not get anyone going crashing out in the comments, as it were. So the Hessians are a catch-all term, at least when we say this in America, and I will say, up until this weekend, like literally, we're recording this a few days before the 4th. Up until last weekend, I was at my family reunion and had never heard an American pronounce the word Hessians in what I thought mentally is the British way, Hessians, until I was talking with my cousin Matt from Tennessee. And there were some reenactors who were sort of coming to the family reunion. And he said, "Oh, Alex, are there any Hessians?" And I was like, "Are you from Piccadilly? What is happening, Mr. East Tennessee? Like, I don't understand right now." So it is, you know, these Hessians aren't even all Hessians. And so for those keeping score at home, I think, roughly in order of the size of the contingent they provide, there are 6 German states within the Holy Roman Empire that send troops to go fight in North America. And they are, again, roughly, some of the smaller ones I'll probably get mixed up, but Hessen-Kassel sends the largest contingent. That's why we call these soldiers Hessians, because most of them, about maybe 18,000 plus of the 30 to 37,000 soldiers who come from these states, come from Hessen-Kassel. The next largest is the state of Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel. Frequently in English, we just call these guys the Brunswickers, or the, in German, the Braunschweigers. Although that can often refer to sausage, so that don't get confused. And then after that, you have a number of smaller states like Anhalt-Zerbst, Ansbach-Bayreuth, Hessen-Hanau, and Waldeck. The Waldeck contingent is very small, and the the Anhalt-Zerbst contingent doesn't arrive until a bit later in the war. They're just getting there for the first time in 1780 and 81 and 82. So they play a more limited role in the war, perhaps, but are still absolutely on the battlefield, even these troops who are arriving relatively late, like Anhalt-Zerbst. So all of these guys fight in the American War of Independence on the British side. They collectively make up between 20 and 25 or 30% of the British soldier, total British commitment of troops to North America, depending on what year and we're talking about and how you calculate it. But collectively, as opposed to saying the German Allied contingent or something like this, we choose in American English, and I'm fairly certain in British English as well, to call these folks Hessians or Hessians, depending on what side of the Atlantic you're on.
Do we know a total number of troops that they send over?
Yeah, depending on whether or not you include replacements and stuff like that, it's between 30,000 and 37,000. I tend to lead more towards the 37,000 figure, but you will frequently see quoted in histories like 30,000. That's a pretty standard and agreed upon number.
That is not an insubstantial amount
it's a fairly large
of men.
Yeah, especially when you look at like some of the size of some of these states, like a county in America is sending troops over to go and fight. I mean, it's a fairly impressive logistical feat. Obviously aided by the British Navy and merchant fleet and things like this. So, yeah.
I think there's a wider point as well about the way Britain uses its money to bolster the fact it's got a small standing army. I mean, you sometimes get the feeling, talking to some of your countrymen, perhaps, that the Hessians were a deliberate ploy to send these evil, dastardly, brutal Germans to put down a peaceful and freedom-loving people. And Britain, in Marlborough's day, they were hiring Danes, they were hiring Dutch to come and help in the 45, and then more Hessians. There are Hanoverian troops who go to Gibraltar during this war, and I think also serve in India. It's the norm. It's not. How can we oppress these rebellious people? It's we need a bigger army. What do we normally do? We need a bigger army. Oh yeah, we hire some guys.
Yeah, I mean in the 1730s, I think, and maybe 34, Walpole calls the Hessians the triarii of Great Britain. I mean, they're very, very standard. One of the standard grab bag of things that you try to do to bulk up the army in wartime. I will also say that the Hessians are probably not any more brutal than any other auxiliary troops that Britain uses in the course of the 18th century. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence to indicate that they're not very brutal. Christopher Duffy has done a lot of work on their involvement in the Jacobite emergency in 1745 and 6, and their unwillingness to participate in some of the reprisals after the collapse at Culloden. The Crown Prince literally writes something to the fact, like, we came over to fight, not to like hang or murder people. Like, if y'all want to do that, that's your decision. We're not going to take part in that. So there's there's a pretty widespread commitment, not to modern rules of engagement or something like this, but to the idea of we were professional soldiers. We're not here to engage in barbarous acts. that continues to some extent in the War of Independence. I mean, there are moments certainly where both Hessian and British soldiers, individual soldiers, commit crimes, and maybe in fighting like the fighting at Connecticut Farms in Springfield. I mean, so large groups of buildings are burned down by these troops because they're being used by rebel soldiers as cover. But absolutely, these men are not that much more brutal. What's the language from the Declaration? Brutal, cruel, or perfidious than the average British soldier. Obviously, Tommy Atkins is a deeply cruel and perfidious guy, so maybe this doesn't. For the British listeners, obviously, I'm joking here. Please calm down. We're having a little fun on July 4th. So
this is, like we've again said, this is a very common use of German auxiliary troops, even not even just against foreign enemies, but like you said, Alex, in the Jacobite rebellion, there's Germans on the British Isles. So why are the colonists, I guess, it's because it's being directed at them. That's the real rub.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. And it's worth saying it's not just, I mean, this is internalized by a lot of Americans in 1776. It's something that is, printed a lot in newspapers. You're saying, "Oh my gosh, he's hiring German guys to come and kill us! Like, this is crazy." And I mean, if you read John Adams' letters to Abigail Adams, I mean, he when he's talking about all the different people that the ministry is enlisting against the colonists. I mean, the Hessians and Hanoverians are right there up in the top of the list. Before we run on from it, I will just say, and I'm going to have to carefully think about how I tell the story. There are not always great relationships, even between British soldiers and the Hessians. I mean, there's a kind of, at the time, and I mean not British people today. At the time, there are British soldiers who kind of think like, why are these foreigners fighting alongside us? This is different. A Hessian Jäger recalled in his diary that a British soldier got drunk and kind of wandered into the Hessian camp and came up to him and was like, sort of poking him, saying, "Hey, Frenchie, have you gotten your pay yet? You guys are just here for the money." And I'll have to edit it a little bit. But this guy spoke English and replied, "I'm a German and you are a piece of excrement." And so that led to them fighting with their swords. They both drew their hangers and kind of fought, and the Hessian killed him. After this, there's a lot of effort by the part of the British command to say, "Hey, remember, these guys are our friends, and we're happy to have them here, and please don't go get drunk and be sword fighting with them." So even at the time, it's sort of a. And I imagine we'll talk about how Americans remember these troops here in a minute. But the interesting part of the Hessians is kind of like nobody likes them. The Americans obviously are using propaganda for all it's worth to sort of say, "Hey, these guys are the enemy, and they're bad guys. We try to fight against them." A lot of the British common soldiers are like, "These guys are maybe a little slow, and maybe there's some of the reasons why we're not always winning this war. We're going to blame it on the Hessians." I mean, they're a wonderful scapegoat. You've got a foreigner scapegoat that you can say, "Hey, these guys messed it up." And they're not English speaking. Some of the other Hessians sort of recall that, man, they really kind of treat us like we're simple until we can speak a few words to them in English. Like, they don't like communicating or trying to communicate with us in French or German. We're the ones who have to learn English. So it is sort of a fascinating story, because it's, in some ways, it's like nobody. If British people in 2026 don't remember the American Revolution at all, kind of nobody remembers the Hessians, and certainly no one remembers the Hessians in a positive way.
So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that these guys are mercenaries in a pretty standard transaction. British will give you this much and you give us this many soldiers. Is that really how the transaction is done?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, these are subsidy agreements. And so when we think of mercenaries in the modern world, even today, I think usually we think about men who are contracting individually, or on the level of like a PMC, like a private military corporation. And so the Hessians are not that. The Hessians are not mercenaries in the classic sense. They are not individually going out and saying, "Hey, I want to go as a man fight over in the British war in North America." They're not saying, "Hey, we've got a group of 100 guys here. We're all going to go fight over in North America." They are members of the militaries of their various states, which is a result of diplomatic agreements between Britain and their sort of parent countries, are in their units being sent over to fight in North America. And so very unhelpfully, there are like a billion different terms for these soldiers and what exactly they're doing. You could call them auxiliaries. You could call them allied troops. I think in modern German, and certainly in my writing, the phrase that's used is Subsidientruppen, so like subsidy troops. This is probably the most accurate descriptor. I would imagine that we're here in the 250th. When we get to the 500th anniversary of America, people will still be calling them mercenaries. Like, that's not something that's going to change. That's not something that's go away. I'm not even sure that that's something that historians should be trying to change. But just be aware they were not mercenaries in the classic sense that we think of when we use that term today. And certainly at the time, they're called mercenaries in the Declaration of Independence. Most European statesmen did not think of this as like a mercenary agreement. Subsidy payments were a very common form of conducting diplomacy. And really these soldiers, it's not like a unique thing. I mean, obviously Thomas Jefferson is quite surprised in that section of the Declaration that I read out, but all the way back into the late and even mid 17th century, agreements like this occurred. Hessians went to go and fight all across the world as a result of these agreements from the 1660s on. They fight against the Swedes in the Scanian War in Danish pay. You can still one of my favorite things to do as a historian when I'm overseas is visit the flags of captured nations. Hopefully it won't break any American brains to know that in the Royal Hospital at Chelsea in London, there are several of our captured flags from the War of 1812 that are hung up in the dining hall. In the Hessian case, there are captured Hessian flags that still hung in churches in Stockholm in Sweden from the Scanian War. And so there are, a long history of these men doesn't always work out really well. For example, they're sent to go fight for the Venetians against the Turks. I mean, so Hessians are battling the Turks in the 1670s and 80s and 90s. And of these two Hessian states, the state of Hessen-Darmstadt, which is not fighting in the American War of Independence, and the state of Hessen-Kassel sends about 1,000 men to go and help the Venetians. In each case, only about 200 come back. So it's usually not always a great thing for you as an individual Hessian if you get sent out. Maybe you are one of the 200 guys who comes back. You make a lot of money from plunder or something like this. 1 in 5 odds. I'm not sure I would take those odds, but for the Hessian state, it's a huge windfall. And so you have it's built into the financial accounting of these small German states. And it allows, these countries the size of like Massachusetts, basically, to have very large standing armies in the 18th century. That the Hessian contribution to the 7 Years' War and Prince Ferdinand's army in the West against the French is 24,000 men. I mean, it's a pretty substantial contribution. Hessen is one of the most militarized places in all of Europe in the 18th century. I mean, a lot of people make, probably because of World War II, a lot of people make a lot of really strong comments on how militarized Prussia is, that there's such a high ratio of soldiers to civilians. I mean, there's like a soldier for every, 25 civilians or something like this. There were social scientists in the 1960s and 70s and 80s were like, that ratio led to all of the, the bad stuff in World War II. And, this Prussian militarism is eventually what gets us Hitler. Well, something that these same social scientists didn't take into account is there's one soldier for every 19 civilians in Hesse. And so, I don't think anyone's ever traced the roots of Hitler to Hesse. It's just, it's how these societies are organized. Famously in the early part of the 18th century, one of the Landgrafs of Hesse, I want to say it's like one of the Wilhelms, he says, the army is our Peru, and that's a reference to like the massive silver mine at Potosi in Peru that sort of fed the Spanish Empire and kept it supplied with money. Like, we don't have colonies, we don't have a sort of giant silver mine that we can just get all of our state revenue from, but we do have soldiers. And so these soldiers enable us to go out and make a lot of money, have a larger army than we would normally have, and then that's sort of like snowballs. We can build up, we can make the army pay for the army. We can sort of take some of the revenue from these soldiers and feed them into our civilian industries and sort of development in the country. And so it's really, in my opinion, actually Charles Ingro, a historian at Purdue University, who has come up with the correct formulation for whether or not the Hessians were mercenaries. His sort of way of thinking about it was actually the state that was mercenary. And so he wrote a wonderful book if you're interested in like finances in Hessen and the way that the state and its soldiers and its money and its people interact. He has a book called The Hessian Mercenary State, which sort of describes these relationships and how they unfold. It's kind of how you generate revenue to promote local industry. You send your soldiers to go fight in Corfu against the Turks, or, America against George Washington. It's just a pretty bog standard practice for statecraft for these German states in the 18th century.
So if these societies are based around exporting soldiers, how does that translate into the quality of soldier training, equipment? Are these guys kind of the cream of the crop? I think that's something we do hear sometimes in American lore of these Hessians, is that they are crazy professional. They come from the Prussian school. They're some of the best troops that England can send. How does that stack up? Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We hope you're enjoying this episode. But if you want to hear more Prime and Load, our Patreon War Room is the place where you can get it. For only $5 a month, you get access to exclusive bonus episodes not available here. Here's a clip from our most recent bonus episode.
I mean, there are many British soldiers who think it's going to be pretty quick. We're going to go in, now that the Empire is striking back, now that we've got the entire sort of army together, the Navy deployed over North America, this is going to be fairly easy. But there are, and I wanted to say, one of them is like a governor at Minorca at one point in his career. You have letters coming in to Lord North, George Germain, saying things like,
the Americans don't actually need to win on the battlefield at all. They can just do some damage to our forces, and we're not going to be able to financially, sustain this war effort. I mean, there are British soldiers to whom the system is flashing red in 1776. There are British soldiers who think pathetic colonials will not be much trouble.
We hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into our most recent bonus episode. If you want to hear the rest of it, use the link in the description to sign up for our Patreon War Room today.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, certainly the Hessians would say so. And I don't think that's, we should necessarily discount that. A Swiss traveler who sort of goes through Hessen in 1781, so right as the American War is coming to an end, like Yorktown's being bombarded as he's traveling through Hessen. Before I came to Hessen, I scarce knew what a military people were. Nearly all the peasants have served, like in the military. Thus, in every village there are men of fine stature, manly form and bearing, and everywhere they talk of war, for in this century the Hessians have not only fought against the French in Germany, but even in Sicily and the Peloponnesus in Greece, and in Hungary under the great Eugene or Eugen, and now in the New World. So certainly they have a lot of military experience. Like I can't really, besides maybe for the British, right? I can't think of another army that has as many diverse military experiences. And obviously, Hugh Davies has just written this great book called The Wandering Army, talking about how the British Army sort of goes throughout the world and sort of picks up on some of the best of military knowledge, as it fights across the world in the 18th into the 18th century into the Napoleonic period. And so I think you could make much the same case for the Hessians. I mean, they're fighting against all sorts of different enemies all across the 18th century. And so they do have a great deal of military experience. Christopher Duffy kind of commenting on the state of the Hessian military. Is it the best military in the world? Maybe. But it's certainly a very experienced professional military that brings a great deal of knowledge and experience to bear on military problems. And you can see this even in like the letters and the debates of war councils involving Hessian and other subsidy troops, that essentially they, when they're asked what to do in a given situation, they immediately say, well, this is sort of similar scrapes we've been in the past. Maybe this is what we could do as a result. It's certainly always on their mind. Certainly, they're uniformed in a similar way to Prussian troops, right? I mean, they've got the blue woolen coats. They have the metal fronted grenadier caps, which Englishmen sometimes call sugarloaf caps. Just like the Prussian army does. They follow here's a shout out to Josh Schopp, one of the great sort of reenactors and authors who's currently working on the Hessians and their drill manual today. There are ways in which the Hessians and what they do on the battlefield and what's in their infantry regulations or reglement is very similar to Prussia. And there's also ways in which they do things in kind of marching to the beat of their own drum, doing things a little bit their own way. I'll probably talk a little bit more about that in the section where we look at tactics on the battlefield in the War of Independence. But absolutely, in broad terms, if you were to just grab someone, I suppose at gunpoint, in 2026 and say, do the Hessian soldiers look like the Prussian soldiers in the 18th century? The average person grabbed off the street would say, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it looks like these guys are interchangeable. They look very similar. They're fighting in a very similar way. They're using similar terminology to describe their tactics. It's a very similar army. Especially after the 7 Years' War, like most armies, the Prussians are sort of the paradigm army. The Hessians are looking at them saying, let's try to be a little bit more like that. Let's explicitly try to make our troops a little bit more like the Prussian troops. There's intermarriage between Hessian dynasties and, the Prussian state. Some officers of the royal family of Hesse serve in the Prussian military. There's a great deal of exchange of ideas, and practice that's shared between these two armies.
And when it comes down to the actual types and kinds of troops that are being sent to America, what are they actually sending? Are they just sending infantry, or are there other types of troops that are going?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say they send as many types of troops almost as exist in their armies. So there are regiments of like heavy cavalry that are not sent over, right? So like guys with sort of garde corps who have like breastplates and things like this, who are almost like 18th century knights, armored men on horseback. It's pretty expensive to transport a regiment of heavy cavalry to North America, and so they're not sent. Basically, every other type of Hessian soldier is sent over to North America. And so it runs the gamut from musketeers, just soldiers in blue coats wearing three-cornered hats, fusiliers, another one of these troops sort of wearing these brass-fronted camps, grenadiers, Jäger, who particular speciality of the Hessian military. They as a result of the kind of landscape and culture in Hesse, it's very relatively mountainous. Bob Selig, who's sort of famous American historian, at least in reenacting circles, often compares like Hessen to West Virginia. I mean, it's kind of like that, that kind of mountainous terrain. I mean, maybe that's not quite the same scale of wilderness, but in some ways you could make the argument that it's a rural mountainous place. There's a big culture of sort of hunting and guns in Hesse during the 7 Years' War, as French armies kind of overran this region of Germany. Kind of like American riflemen grabbed their guns to go and fight against the British in the War of Independence. Hessian riflemen or Jäger grabbed their weapons to sort of defend their homeland against the French in the 7 Years' War at battles like the Battle of Sondershausen in 1758. There's a large, just sort of volunteer contingent of Hessian militiamen who are rifle armed, fighting against the French. So absolutely this sort of Jäger culture that kind of marks Hessen Kassel. They send a number of these soldiers over. British, as I think I've said in other episodes, the British are very keen on having these Jäger. They think that's going to be like the counterpoint to American riflemen. If the Americans have their riflemen and we have these Germanic Jäger forces, we'll be able to sort of have parity with the Americans. So this is something at least that the British are highly interested in. Some contingents send light cavalry, just light dragoons. There are, I think the Braunschweigers, or Colonel Baum's dragoons, are sent over with their forces. You also have, in some states, they're organized more like an Austrian military footing, and so it's kind of weird. But there are guys who look like they're Croats, and sort of wearing their capes, who are sent over to fight in North America. So I mean, again, huge diversity of forces. One of my favorite units, sometimes is actually, especially Todd Brasted, describes these as loyalists. I think that's pretty fair. A guy named Lieutenant Deemer forms a unit out of like basically prisoners of war who have escaped back to New York City, frequently from the Brunswick contingent that was captured at Saratoga. He forms them into a unit of hussars, and so you have hussars fighting over in Germany. You have hussars fighting here in North America, not explicitly sent over by their states, but the thought is, man, some of these German troops, they know what hussars do, they know what they're like. Let's form them kind of on the fly into a unit of hussars. Again, with the exception of really heavy cavalry, as many troop types as you can think of are sent to artillery. I didn't mention there are artillerists who come over from all these different states. Right, it's a very it's a smorgasbord basically of different types of soldiers. And if 37,000 men are sent over, it would have to be right. I mean, it's a very big commitment of soldiers.
If you're enjoying this episode of Prime and Load, the best thing you can do to help us grow is to tell somebody about it. Not a review, not a rating, just tell one friend, one history lover, one person you think would enjoy it. Reviews are great, but they're never as powerful as a personal recommendation. We're still a small show run by people who genuinely love this period of history, and word of mouth is how shows like ours grow. If there's someone in your life that loves this period, or even the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War, please share with them your favorite Prime and Load episode. After all, who would Napoleon, Lee, or Grant be without Frederick, Marlborough, or Washington? And when do we first see these German soldiers in action in America?
Yeah, so the first time they arrive and fight is in like a large, meaningful way, is at the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776. It's a few months on now, or maybe 2 months on now from where we are in the story. We're going to have a big discussion, I think, of the New York campaign, so I won't go into that in a huge way, but there are a couple of divisions of troops that cross the Atlantic separately on ships from Hessen Kassel. They arrive, they're staged, they're sort of gotten off the ships. I mean, a lot of the men are seasick. Some of them are suffering from the effects of malnutrition on ship. They're given a couple days to kind of get their health in order, and then immediately begin drilling to fight in North America. They start forming in 2 ranks as opposed to the 3-rank line when they get to North America. This is something that the leading Hessian general, at least in 1776, General Heister, believes is he's encouraged to do this by the British. He follows up on and does this himself. So this is as soon as they arrive and begin going into action, they start kind of adapting to the fighting in North America.
So that was actually something I wanted to pick up on. You'd rather nicely set the question up there, because almost as old as the tradition of Britain hiring foreign auxiliaries is the tradition of Britain blaming the foreign auxiliaries when things go wrong, because we're like that. And the perception, perhaps, as far as there is one in British quarters of the Hessians, is they're very slow, they're very hidebound. They're fighting a European war in North America, and I guess this, to some extent, in terms of the contemporary thinking, plays into the post-war discussions that the British have about whether they want an army that fights in a European way or an army that fights in a North American way. But you've mentioned there one case of tactics and doctrine being modified. Are there other ways, in the way that the British Army adapts through the course of the war? Do the Hessians continue to develop in the same sort of way?
Yeah, absolutely. So to some extent, Andrew, it kind of depends on the contingent. So I would say that the folks from Hessen Kassel and the folks from Hessen Hanau and the Braunschweigers are not all answering this question the same way. But broadly speaking, there is adaptation on all of these contingents. So the army in the north with Burgoyne, which primarily consists of troops from Hessen-Hanau and troops from Brunswick, they pretty much followed the British model. There are orders that indicate they form in 2 ranks, and they also extend the files and form an open order, much like the British are fighting throughout the War of Independence. In the Hessen-Hanau orderly book for one of their infantry regiments, there's a comment, you open the files to 18 inches, just like the British are doing in this time. So that maybe because it's, they're more isolated. There's not a big Hessian army. It's only a group of about 6,000 Hessian soldiers. They feel maybe some more pressure to fight tactically like the British do. In the New York campaign, the main Hessian army, that is to say, like the actual Hessians from Hessen-Kassel, they fight in kind of a mixed way. They at least in the New York campaign, fight in two ranks, but they don't open up their files. They sort of retain the formation in close order. They also try to use skirmishers, and I think it's fair to say that most armies use skirmishing parties in the American War of Independence, but I think the Hessians are a little bit more explicit in saying we're going to peel men off from the line battalions and send them out in front of the sort of closed formation to clear the way. Almost like in a Napoleonic concept of skirmishing. This is something that I've written a lot about, a couple articles and a chapter in an edited volume. These skirmishers, the Hessians call them, depending on the writer, flunkerer or plunkerer or blunkerer. It's something that's sort of a French loan word, and so they spell it in a variety of different ways. These men are going out in like little knots, maybe musketeers and grenadiers sort of mixed together. In some battles, musketeers, grenadiers, and Jäger kind of all mixed together, clearing the way in front of these battalions. And in a report back to the Landgraf, back to sort of Frederick II of Hessen-Kassel, the commanding general Heister says, man, we've found that using these skirmishers detached out in front of the battalions is the best way to fight in North America. Keep the sort of solid frontage of your battalion, but send your skirmishers out to sort of fight with the Americans in the woods. I mean, this is kind of the best of both worlds. Other letters home from the like the Hessian troops in the course of the New York campaign make comments like the skirmishers are doing all the fighting. Like, there's not always a chance for soldiers in the main battalions to get into action because it's the skirmishers who are out there, sort of, on the cutting edge of the advance, leading the way into the fight. And so for the Hessian military in the 18th century in North America, this is the way that they're adapting to North America. I'm not fully convinced, and you can read this in my chapter in Don Haggis' book, Waging War in North America, which came out with Hellion. I'm not fully convinced this is wholly an adaptation in North America. There's evidence to indicate that maybe the Hessian military was doing something similar to this in the 7 Years' War in Europe against the French, and they're just kind of continuing to refine this practice in the deployment of these skirmishers against the Americans during the New York campaign. So both of the main contingents of Hessians, the contingent from Hessen-Kassel and the contingent from Brunswick, adapt in different ways. The Hessians say, hey, let's stay close together and send out skirmishers. The Braunschweigers say, hey, let's do exactly what the British are doing, open our files up and fight in that manner.
So with all these differences, it sounds like there's definitely room for some operational and tactical disagreements. Headbutting, maybe. We alluded to it a little bit. Is there friction between the German commanders and British commanders? Because
yeah, absolutely. I don't know that I want to like fully lean into modern analogy and say that the British view the Hessians like American soldiers view the Iraqi army in 2014 or something like this. But you do get the sense in a lot of these British soldiers' letters that they view the Hessians almost as like their redheaded stepchild brother. Like they don't really like them very much, but they kind of like feel like they have to take care of them in some ways. I mean, there's a lot of complaints in letters back home from British officers saying Hessians are very slow. We run on at a jog, and the Hessians are kind of sort of marching steadily on behind us. I think there's probably some truth to this. I don't think that the Hessians are moving at the same speed, and indeed, when Hessian soldiers, and again, I'm using that kind of catch-all term, like folks from Hessen Hanau in Canada are forced to move at the same pace as the British do. They write in their diary, they're like, man, we're running everywhere. This is really weird. Like, it's hard to keep the guys in order. By the late war, actual soldiers from Hessen Kassel are deployed in small numbers in the southern campaign, the von Bosse regiment. And this is literally like the language of their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Dubai, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He says, we ran forward to meet the enemy in tolerable order. So they're like, we're not, the guys aren't all lined up. There's some disorder in the ranks, but man, we're running. Captain Pausch, who's in the Hessen Hanau artillery, makes the comment, I've never seen anyone fight like this. I've seen people run after like game when they're hunting like this fast, but like people are like running around like crazy, and I'm not really sure what's going on here. He thinks it's like in the heat in America, it's detrimental to the soldiers' health to make them like run everywhere. And someone who's jogged in America before, I can't fully disagree with him there. Like, America is a very, very hot place compared to Northern Europe. So I guess, you see questions and frictions like, how slow are the Hessians? And, are they actually capable of keeping up with British soldiers on the battlefield? There's a wonderful description of the fighting at the Battle of First Savannah on, I think it's like December 29th, 1778, where the commander says, the guy giving the battle report says, yeah, I really enjoyed the Highlanders, the 71st Regiment, who charged forward to meet the enemy. They did great. And also I really appreciated the forward countenance of the Hessian regiment that was with me. Like, not they ran on, but they really intimidated the rebels by having this forward-facing countenance that, they were intimidating from a distance, maybe, as the Highlanders ran forward. So yeah, I do think there's some not necessarily bad blood between the higher administration of the army. There are maybe middle-ranking officers, lieutenants and captains who are like, man, these Hessian guys, are they fast enough to fight the kind of war that we need to fight in America? It's a high speed, low drag war for tactical operators in their perspective, and maybe the Hessians are not quite there yet. I will say, though, some of the real friction that I've seen is not between the Hessian commanders in North America and the British commanders in North America, but between the Hessian officers in America and the government back home. And so one of the great themes of the Hessian troops in the War of Independence is that the officers on the ground are always like, yeah, let's adapt and sort of fight like the British fight. Like, let's try to fight like they're fighting. And they're getting letters from their Landgraf back in Germany saying, no, do not do this. We fight the way that we're supposed to fight. Don't fight the way the British are fighting. It's in the 1776 campaign, for example, there's questions about whether, for some of that campaign, the Hessen Kassel Hessians may have opened their ranks to fight like the British did. But very quickly they got a letter from the Landgraf saying, yeah, no, don't do that. Form in closed order. He wants them to sort of form back into 3 ranks and instead of 2. Hessian officers, because they're concerned about being a target for American riflemen, strip off like some of the gold lace on their hats and on their clothing. They're carrying sort of muskets and bayonets in order to avoid being taken as targets by American riflemen. The Landgraf says, yeah, don't do that. Put all the gold lace back on the hats. Don't just look like common soldiers. That's not what we want. We want our military to look like. And so there is friction between the Hessian forces and their home governments as a result of the adaptation that they are maybe doing on their own initiative. Maybe they're being pressured by the British to perform some of these adaptations, trying to have the army micromanaged from a distance is one of the challenges that the Hessians face. The Landgraf, Friedrich II of Hessen-Kassel, he is a soldier himself. He was the guy who commanded the Hessians when he was the crown prince, fighting against the Jacobites in the 1745 uprising. Obviously, he goes on to serve in the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War as well. A man with a great deal of military experience. He kind of thinks hey, I was in the army. I know what it's like. Let's not change things up too much. This is my military. I don't want them fighting kind of the same crazy ways the British are fighting.
Hi, this is Lee Gugino, and on behalf of Alex and Andrew, I want to say thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we really hope you're enjoying it. But did you know that this is only part of the conversation? Typically, our recordings are anywhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours long, and we have to cut them down to stay within our upload limits. But you can get full access to these uncut versions of every episode by joining the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For just $3 a month, you can listen to the additional 20 to 40 minutes of content that you don't get here, and all of it is commercial free. If you want even more, you can also upgrade and gain access to exclusive bonus episodes that can only be found in the War Room. If you're enjoying Prime and Load and want more, use the link in this episode's description to visit the Prime and Load War Room today. Is there any indication of what the common soldiers thought about America? I think we talked a little bit about it in our Halloween episode. What does the common German soldier think about being in North America?
They love it. I think it's really cool. They love McDonald's. They love freedom. No, in all seriousness, I got a laugh out of Andrew. That makes me happy. So. In all seriousness, they are shocked by the material wealth of America. And it's not to say that people in Hesse are living in mud huts in abject poverty. I mean, there are certainly peasants who are doing quite well in Hesse, but they're shocked by how good things are in America. There are comments from ordinary Hessian sort of soldiers and low-ranking officers who write home to their families saying things like, "The common people in America live better than nobles live in Europe." It's that kind of distinction. And so I think to some extent they were a little shocked that this rebellion occurred over taxes, because they are oh my gosh, life is incredible here in America. People are eating meat all the time. This is amazing. There is sort of a sense of, man, the Americans have a lot of money, and hopefully we're going to get a chance to get some of that and plunder a little bit. So there is some of that going on. There's a lot of songs that the Hessian soldiers are singing, man, we're going to go get gold in America. This is going to be great. America's really rich. We're going to get some of that for ourselves. Again, I don't think there's anything to suggest that the ordinary Hessian soldier plunders any more than the ordinary British soldier does. And certainly in comparison to the way that civilians are treated in the Napoleonic Wars, I think American civilians are treated much better. If I can say this in front of Andrew, I do think that ordinary British soldiers kind of have a chip on their shoulder against Americans and are frustrated about the nature of the rebellion. The Hessians, again, kind of like in the Jacobite emergency, sort of think, man, this is kind of an internal dispute. We don't like rebels. Famously, when the American commander of Fort Washington, future Fort Kniphausen, comes to surrender to General Kniphausen, he goes to shake his hand, which is like a very American way to like greeting the enemy general, and Kniphausen famously says, "I will not shake hands with a rebel." So like, you guys are kind of beyond the pale here. There is this sense of, the religious language of rebellion against the king is rebellion against God, the natural order of things. The Hessians do believe in sort of they're Calvinists. They do believe in a universe that's kind of ordered by God, strictly controlled by God. They do buy into this idea that you shouldn't be rebelling against your sovereign. This is not it's just not done. And so there's some resentment there against Americans. But the Hessians do kind of think that America is, I won't say like the promised land, but like certainly a land flowing with milk and honey. They're very impressed by all of the material wealth that Americans have. If I could just run on to this point for a little longer, I will also say that the Hessians are very shocked by the practice of African slavery. This is something they write a lot about, particularly when they're deployed to the southern colonies. The Hessian officers like August von Dinklage go to Charleston, and they're shocked by the beatings that they see occur. And Dinklage records in his diary that he sees like a plantation owner beating an African American and like physically intervenes and like tells the plantation owner to leave, like at gunpoint basically, because he's never seen something like this before. There are narratives that in places like South Carolina, in colonial America, that African Americans are not really human beings, that there's like a dual creation by God, like God made white people and then he made African Americans. They're not exactly the same species. And so the Hessians, they have a very sort of religious outlook, and they're interested in theology. I mean, they're an army that like sings hymns when they go into battle. And so officers like Andreas Wiederholt, he's a POW in Virginia, and he recalls like an enslaved woman asking, like, do you think that like black people are made by the same God that made white people? And he's like, absolutely. Like, we are all children of God. We're all made by the same creator. And so there is, because they never experienced anything like this before, there is a great interest, and I would say maybe even on the part of some Hessians, a great sympathy towards African Americans. There are, I would say hundreds, but I don't know that we know the exact numbers. It's probably fewer than 1,000, certainly, black men who join Hessian regiments. Some of them, again, at least 100, return to Hessen-Kassel with these soldiers at the end of the war, kind of having escaped slavery. Many, again, because the 18th century mores, many of them are recruited as musicians. 18th century European armies loved to have like Turkish style bands. And so having an African drummer, or an African American drummer in this case, is like a way of showing prestige in the unit, that you have a sort of a Turkish or a Moorish band. And so many of these men come again, 100 plus of these men return to Germany, and live in Hessen. There are some articles, I think, in recent years that have shown that like the Landgraf becomes the godfather to some of these black men's children in Hessen. So it is sort of a complicated story of their relationship to America, and one in which, because I think many enslaved African Americans and enslaved Africans are trying to escape slavery. Many of them go into British units, go to places like the Caribbean and Nova Scotia when the war is done. Some go back to England. Likewise, the same is happening in Hessian units, and there are articles and sort of discussions of this by historians like starting in the 1970s forward. They're absolutely fascinating if folks want to dig deeper.
If I could just rewind a minute, Alex, obviously one reaction to being in a wealthy country is, well, great, I'm going to loot some of this and take a nice pot of gold back to Hess. The other one might well be, well, this is great over here. I don't really fancy walking around in a tight blue coat and a brass hat and getting shot at. I want a piece of this myself. So, is desertion a problem if it's such a great place to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, how can you say no to McDonald's, right? No, in all seriousness, desertion is a bit of a problem. I would say I got to be careful what I say here. If you believe comments on like genealogical Facebook groups, you might think that every Hessian deserted to stay in North America. And certainly there are many Americans who have a Hessian ancestor. It's not uncommon. I am one of them. My guy went back to Germany and then came back, but it's not crazy. Depending on which exact contingent we're talking about, I would say that people soldiers deserted to stay in North America at a rate of between 12 and 18%. That might seem enormous. Like, imagine if almost 20% of the U.S. military deserted to stay in Iraq. Like, there would be a wall-to-wall news coverage about this, right? In the context of 18th century Europe, that's not a huge desertion rate. In the context of 18th century North America, that's not a huge desertion rate. I don't want to make America look bad on the 250th anniversary episode here, but by comparison, 25% or 1 in 4 American soldiers, continental soldiers, deserted in the course of the American War of Independence. Pay was not forthcoming. Food was bad. You weren't getting great clothes. All of those things encouraged soldiers to desert. That's probably why some continental soldiers deserted in the course of the war. I will say most of that 12 and 18% came at the end of the war. They didn't desert while the fighting was ongoing. The fighting is kind of wrapping up, and they say, I'm not married. I don't have a lot of stuff going back for me in Hessen Kassel. Life in America looks pretty good. I'm just going to stay here now that the war is done. There are some units and some states that actually give permission for their soldiers to say, hey, if you want to leave now, that's going to save us, logistical hassles on the way back to Germany. That's fine. So there are a lot of Hessians who stay. There is even a very concentrated effort by American soldiers, statesmen, diplomats to recruit Hessians into the Continental Army. Benjamin Franklin and George Washington both think that Hessian POWs will be convinced basically to stay in America and fight for the American army. And there's a fairly concentrated effort to recruit these men. I would also say that especially by the middle years of the war, you have the Hessian POWs are treated a little nicer than the British POWs to try and maybe like facilitate some of this desertion. So some of that is a response to British conditions on British Prussian hulks in New York Harbor. Some of that is an effort to try and sort of get the Hessians to come over to the American side in large numbers. But it's not shocking. Many Americans, obviously not all, many Americans do have kind of Hessian ancestry, particularly in the like the Shenandoah Valley region, parts of Maryland. I mean, if you drive from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Washington D.C., you'll notice mountains like Castleman Mountain. I wonder who named that. It's probably a Hessian, right? So I mean, there are absolutely signs, and the figures that I quoted between 12 and 18% come from the work of a phenomenal historian who was the outside reader of my master's thesis, a guy named Daniel Krebs, who wrote a book on Hessian POWs and their treatment called A Generous and Merciful Enemy, kind of looking at the Hessian perception of their time as prisoners of war. On the whole, many of these Hessians still kind of think like, man, Americans have got it twisted. They shouldn't be rebelling against their king. That's a rebellion against God. A few, maybe one in five, if you're stretching it, Hessians say, man, these Americans might be, a bit rebellious, but man, it's hard to say no to having beefsteaks every dinner. I think I might stay here in America.
What would be the one thing that you would have everybody learn and know and understand about these soldiers during the American Revolution?
So I guess I would say, first of all, if you're not a reenactor or historian and you call these soldiers mercenaries, like, that's fine. I'm not going to like come down the chimney and attack you. But I do think that trying to understand maybe the like complicated legal place that these soldiers were in is helpful. Just calling, like, as I kind of opened with, right? Whether you're the British and you want to use them as a scapegoat, or you're the Americans and you want to use them, describe them as like, cruel and perfidious. Very rarely has historical, or you're the like German writers in like the 60s and 70s, and you want to describe them as like, helpless victims. Very rarely has this they've been viewed as like protagonists in their own story, or as like, the good guys in their own story. And so I think it's worth trying to like put yourselves in the shoes of these men, and try to sort of understand their mental framework. They didn't view themselves as doing anything bad or illegal or mercenary. They didn't view themselves as being particularly cruel in how they treated civilians in North America. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they probably treat American civilians better on average than the sort of British red-coated enlisted man in the 18th century. So viewing them as like bumbling mercenaries who got drunk on Christmas and George Washington came over and attacked them, is some of those words are true. They were not drunk at Trenton. Like that's not a real thing. And there are American soldiers, I think it's Josiah Greenman, who writes in his diary that he did not believe that a single drop of alcohol was drunk at the battle of or before the Battle of Trenton. So the idea that they were drunk on Christmas and that's why George Washington won literally comes from like an offhand comment that George Washington makes before the battle. He says they make much of Christmas in Germany. And 19th century historians extrapolated from that one statement to say, oh wow, they were all drunk and that's why Americans won. So the idea that they're bad soldiers, not very accurate. The idea that they're mercenaries, not very accurate. The idea that they're cruel, is not very accurate. They might be a little slow. They might, not always adapt perfectly to North America. As the, temperature gauge reaches 99 in my community in West Virginia this week, I'm not sure that I'm perfectly adapted to North America. So it can be challenging. By and large, these men came over from their mental framework. They fought honorably in America. They scored significant successes in America. There were defeats like Trenton and Bennington, Red Bank, and then they returned at war's end. For most of these men, in the story of their lives, they didn't view America as like this colossal defeat where they failed to stop the creation of the new United States. They viewed it like they viewed many of these other wars, as a chance to learn, as a chance to attempt to add to their like repertoire of military experiences that made them such excellent professional soldiers. And so if you look at the writings of a lot of soldiers from the Napoleonic period from this part of Germany, many of them do reference events in North America and sort of the styles of fighting that they picked up in North America as a way of trying to, bring their military experiences forward. Many of these soldiers end up being more senior commanders in the Napoleonic Wars. Johann Ewald, probably the single most famous diarist from the Hessian troops, from Hessen-Kassel, in the American War of Independence, goes on to be like a very senior general in Denmark during the Napoleonic Wars. Another Jäger officer, Johann Hinrichs, ends up becoming like a brigadier or major general in the Prussian army. He's fighting in the 1813 campaign over in Europe. These men don't view America as like the whole of their story. They viewed America as a chance to learn, gain military experience that they continued to apply throughout the rest of their military lives and their careers. And so as a result, again, it's easy to think of them as like mercenary, cruel bad guys. From their perspective, they were deeply religious men. We sort of saw an ordered world. We're trying to assist a neighboring country in the sort of prevention of rebellion, which they viewed as a rebellion against God. They brought keen, inquisitive minds to North America. Trying to understand its native people, its environment, its animals, its plant life. In some ways, I think that their story and encounter and experience with America is similar to with many sort of continental Europeans. They came over, they were fascinated by the country. Many of them stayed, made a life here, became Americans. The Hessians are not just a blip in American history or like a funny anecdote about people being drunk on Christmas. They're part of the American story. They're part of the varied communities that make up the United States, going even in sort of ancestral terms down to the present day. That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.